like to start by painting a picture for you, and I want you to tell me if this sounds familiar to any of you. So imagine the following. Many years ago, a good and decent man is arrested and hauled before a judge. He's charged with crimes for which he's clearly innocent. He's forced to defend himself without representation. There is a violent and antagonistic crowd demanding his conviction. The elites of his day wish earnestly for his condemnation. The judge is far from impartial and greatly intimidated by the desires of this raucous crowd and ruling elites. And despite all these odds, the defendant outwits his interrogator and is only convicted on false testimony. He's then led through the city streets amidst jeering crowds, and he's taken to his place of execution, where he forgives his executioner, prays for his tormentors before submitting to death. Now, who does that sound like to you guys? Anybody want to throw out a suggestion? Jesus. Certainly that's true. But incredibly, it is also true of the trial, conviction, and execution of St. Thomas More, down to the letter. And I'm sure you'll agree that after exploring his life a little bit with me, you'll agree that it must have brought St. Thomas More some comfort to know that his path to martyrdom so closely paralleled the passion of his Savior, Jesus Christ. So why is St. Thomas More important? It's impossible to make a thorough study in the time we have of the entirety of the Catholic legal tradition and origins and sources, but I would offer to you that there is a general consensus among church historians and Catholic lawyers that how we as modern Catholics should approach the practice and the application and the enforcement of the law and the achievement of justice is St. Thomas More himself. He is, and rightly should be, a North Star for lawyers, politicians, and diplomats in the conduct of their affairs. Now, some of you may have a passing familiarity with St. Thomas More, with his life story. If not, I would just like to relay some kind of basic biographical facts, and then we can kind of delve into his revealing and rather laudable character. So, when he was Sir Thomas More when he was alive, he was born in London in 1478. His father, Sir John More, himself was a successful lawyer and later a judge. Sir Thomas More was educated in the classical style at one of the finest Catholic schools in London. He served as a page or a young servant to the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is believed to have benefited More tremendously as he saw up close the religious, royal, political, and diplomatic machinations of the great men of his day that visited the Archbishop's dining table. The Archbishop, who saw the great promise in St. Thomas More that the world would later discover, nominated him to study at Oxford, that great center of European learning. But his stay at Oxford was brief. Likely at his father's urging, he commenced his legal studies soon after leaving Oxford after 2 years. But despite all this academic promise, More, for a time, harbored ambitions of a different kind. He sought to pursue a life of holy orders as a priest or a monk. In fact, he spent several years in a religious community discerning whether God was going to call him to that vocation. Ultimately, More concluded that celibacy would not suit him, and he resolved to be a family man and not a man of a cloth, joking one time that he'd prefer to be a God-fearing husband rather than an immoral priest. So in short order, More was elected to Parliament in 1504 and married the next year. He immediately made a name for himself in Parliament, and in one famous episode, he drew the anger of King Henry VII to such a degree that the king imprisoned and fined More's father over the younger More's role in a parliamentary dispute. Everything changed, though, in 1508, when that king, King Henry VII, died, and his son, King Henry VIII, took the throne, with whom More would develop an extraordinarily close bond. Now, More was widowed early, but he remarried immediately, and between his natural-born children, his adopted children, and his stepchild, his household was a large one. And although Thomas More was educated exclusively among men. In his personal life, he insisted that his daughters and his daughters-in-law receive the same quality education as the male members of the family, and More saw to this personally. In the years that followed, More would attain a higher and higher office in London. He went from the under-sheriff of London to commissioner of the sewers, which for a filthy city like London is apparently a sought-after post. He was a member of the Privy Council and various diplomatic positions, as well as serving as a judge in various capacities. As a judge, Thomas More was renowned for his brilliance and his impartiality. Taking bribes back then was a matter of course, and More was one of the few who refused. He was very efficient as well, moving along the gears of justice. But notwithstanding all his professional and personal success, Thomas More always found time for meditation and prayer. Meditation and prayer, I'm sorry. His devotion to his Catholic faith was legendary. He was also a prolific writer, authoring dozens of books and pamphlets and statements on the faith in his life. In fact, he wrote extensively about, in opposition to the Luther reforms, the Martin Luther reforms, the Reformation that was sweeping the continent of Europe in the early 16th century. It was this Protestant Reformation that would be the catalyst of the greatest period of tribulation for More in his life, and it ultimately paved the path to his own martyrdom. Now, in his time, he served as Speaker of Parliament, where he called for free speech rights for lawmakers. And ultimately, in 1529, the seminal event, which is captured in this picture here, he was appointed by the king as Lord Chancellor of England, the chief government minister, effectively the prime minister of that day, who was the highest lay position in the realm. And as Lord Chancellor, St. Thomas More's duties included dealing with heresies, judicial matters, and assisting the king, Henry VIII, in defending the Catholic faith from what they viewed as the Luther heresies of the Protestant Reformation. Now, one fascinating aspect of More's involvement is that he himself had been working and advocating for change within the church for many years. But More believed that Luther's movement was an overreaction that threatened the unity of the church and civil order itself. More's view is best captured by the modern Archbishop Fulton Sheen. And if you guys don't know Fulton Sheen, I would really encourage you to get to know him. He's extraordinary. He was the most important American Catholic of the 20th century. And something that Archbishop Sheen said really captures what I think was More's view of the Reformation, which is there was a reform of doctrine when there should have been a reform of morals. The church at the time, many churchmen back then were corrupt. But what happened in More's view and others' view is that there was an overreaction and there was a reform of perfectly legitimate doctrine going back to the origins of the church and the early church fathers. And so because of this, More felt called to defend the church. And he wrote or contributed to many anti-Luther writings. Interestingly, one of those writings was King Henry's own defense of the Seven Sacraments, which ironically earned Henry VIII the title conferred by the Pope of Defender of the Faith. I say that ironically because shortly thereafter, King Henry, in his bid to divorce his wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, would break from Rome just as Luther had. And King Henry VIII claimed supremacy over the Church of England. He wished to marry a woman named Anne Boleyn, which might be a name that's familiar to you. King Henry succeeded. He did later marry Anne Boleyn, and then he executed her, a fate met by several of Henry's 6 wives. Now, More was a staunch believer in the supremacy of the Holy See, and greatly troubled by his friend the king's usurpation of the title head of the church. More would not consent to it, although he never spoke out against the king on this point. He remained silent. That was part of his legal strategy. However, More's hand was ultimately forced when the king arranged for Parliament to pass a law requiring an oath to be taken, recognizing Henry VIII as head of the Catholic Church. More's conscience prevented him from taking that oath. And as we know, he was imprisoned and later executed because of it, all by his friend Henry VIII. Now, after his execution in 1535, More's philosophical and legal legacy in England was completely suppressed. However, his family was instrumental in preserving More's work, which, thank God, survives today. Pope Pius XI, 90 years ago in 1935, canonized Sir Thomas More and made him St. Thomas More as a martyr alongside his fellow Englishman, Cardinal John Fisher. That's another name. If you guys don't know Cardinal John Fisher, I'd urge you to acquaint yourself with him. He was an extraordinary person. He was executed just days before Thomas More. And St. John Fisher has a singular distinction in the church, and it is this. He's the only cardinal of the church ever to be martyred for their faith. And of all the thousands of cardinals in the history of the Catholic Church, none had ever been murdered because of their faith. And the way it came about is John Fisher was imprisoned in the Tower of London. If you've ever visited London, you can go to the Tower and you can see where John Fisher and Thomas More were imprisoned. It's extraordinary. It's all preserved. The Pope in Rome thought if he made John Fisher a cardinal, there was no way Henry VIII was going to execute him. Well, unfortunately, the Holy Father underestimated Henry VIII's depravity because he went along and executed him anyway. And now St. John Fisher has that singular distinction of being the only Catholic cardinal ever martyred in the faith. In the year 2000, 25 years ago, Pope John Paul II declared St. Thomas More the patron saint of statesmen and politicians. But interestingly, during his canonization, the Pope recognized that More was not a perfect man, noting in the proclamation, "It can be said that he demonstrated in a singular way the value of moral conscience, even if in his actions against heretics, he reflected the limits of the culture of his time." And that is true, and it's something that is on More's record. He did participate in the execution of heretics, which was the law at the time of England. So let's briefly touch on three of what I think are the defining elements of Thomas More's character. The first is conscience and courage. It's often said that St. Thomas More was a preeminent man of conscience, and that's certainly true. His conscience led him to break with the heretical king and resign his high position. He voluntarily forfeited all of the rank and privilege of the world, of the temporal world, to follow his conscience. The Catechism of the Catholic Church calls your conscience, quote, the law of the mind, unquote, which I think is a particularly useful analogy for our audience today. The notion of conscience in our Catholic tradition is inextricably linked to the dignity of the human person. The Church teaches that each human is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore possesses an inherent dignity that must be respected. The Catechism goes on to say that the conscience must be nurtured through education towards the promotion of virtue. And it's a lifelong and never-ending discipline. You never finish forming your conscience. And like a good legal argument, conscience is all about the source of information that you use for it. The Church teaches that the wellspring of a well-formed Catholic conscience are things like divine law, the Scripture, natural law, sacred tradition, the magisterium, which is the teaching authority of the Church, and other traditional notions such as the Golden Rule. Importantly, conscience is not simply a voice in your head. The Catechism says that people have in their heart a law inscribed by God. Conscience is man's most secret core and sanctuary. And even the ABA model rules that govern the conduct of lawyers with respect to their clients expressly allow for moral considerations to come into play when managing your relationship with your client. So if a client wishes to pursue an immoral path, the attorney may or must withdraw, which is precisely what happened in More's situation. When the king pursued his immoral twin aims of divorcing his wife without cause and seizing for himself the authority of the Holy See, More could no longer serve him in good conscience. Now, it's important to note also that there's a communal aspect to conscience formation. And that notion is important to this group because you all can help yourself in your own formation, to bolster one another, especially in the context of such a difficult environment as law school. In addition to other activities, you should consider praying together. You should attend Mass together. You should say the Rosary together. You can and should help each other in these respects. Conscience must be formed by deep devotion to study and prayer and faith. And if done properly, conscience leads us to choose good over evil. And Sir Thomas More, listening to God speaking to him through his conscience, rightly declined to recognize Henry as the vicar of Christ. But his conscience did compel him down a courageous but ultimately deadly path. More also demonstrated his courage in small ways too. My favorite example is, as a judge, Thomas More ruled against a member of his own family. His son-in-law brought an action, a civil action, and it ended up before Thomas More. Obviously, they didn't have very good conflict of interest rules back then because More could still hear the case, but he concluded that the suit was unjust and ruled against his son-in-law, which must have not made for a happy home, but it was the right thing to do. So courage is a central hallmark of Thomas More's moral legacy. But courage, we know, is not limited to Catholics, it's not limited to lawyers. In preparing this talk, and specifically in looking at the similarities between the trial of Jesus Christ and the trial of Thomas More, I was reminded of a very courageous person that features prominently in the saga of Holy Week, that of St. Joseph of Arimathea. Has anybody heard of St. Joseph of Arimathea? A couple people. He gained popular mention in, there was an Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which was as popular as it was completely errant in many of its teachings. But St. Joseph of Arimathea featured prominently in that movie. But the Gospels tell us that he was a senior member of the Jewish Council, somebody not unlike Thomas More, who was respected, he held a high position, and he was a very faithful person, in his case, to Judaism. But St. Joseph of Arimathea had secretly come to believe in Jesus. And because of that, because of the events that he witnessed on Good Friday, Joseph of Arimathea had the courage to go to Pontius Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave it to him, and St. Joseph of Arimathea then arranged for Jesus' burial in a tomb, a new tomb that Joseph of Arimathea owned. It was his own. And we should understand that in the first century, especially in the Jewish tradition, tombs were multi-generational. This isn't an individual plot that you go by at Forest Lawn. Descendants upon descendants are expected to lie in these family tombs, and then their bones are collected in a chamber below, and it's supposed to go on for decades and centuries. And so I meditated on what a courageous sacrifice that must have been for St. Joseph, to give his new family tomb to a complete stranger. And this was not a private thing. It was a very public act. And to do that, to give it to Jesus, someone considered by Joseph's contemporaries as an itinerant preacher who was regularly crucified by the Romans, must have been a tremendous act of courage for him to do that. Interestingly, St. Joseph of Arimathea is credited by legend with bringing the Catholic faith to England. Now, you know, with the saints, they didn't have great paperwork back then, so we know some things about the saints, then we suspect some things, and then there's kind of legend. But St. Joseph is credited with bringing the Catholic faith to England. In fact, in Glastonbury in England, there's a very old church that's named after St. Joseph of Arimathea. And how apropos it was that it was St. Joseph of Arimathea that planted the Catholic faith in England. And 1,500 years later, it blossomed into St. Thomas More, a man of unquestionable conscience and courage. I'd like to mention that also about St. Thomas More's piety and his humility. No man in the whole of England would have been more justified to be conceited and unapproachable than St. Thomas More in his prime. In law and in politics and in diplomacy, St. Thomas More had no equal in England at the time. And in his day, and we see it in our day too, oftentimes The achievement of fame and fortune can sometimes displace the need for God. But More's achievements and his standing did not diminish his piety, his humility, and his devotion to his Catholic faith. For More, nothing topped piety, the practice of the faith, especially in the home, what we call today the domestic church. Each night, More would convene his entire household, family and servants, and the entire house would pray for the liturgy of the hours. They would recite the Psalms, the litany of saints, and on feast days, the entire divine office would be recited, and Mass was strictly observed on Sundays and feast days. In my view, one of the most moving examples of More's devotion was the circumstances surrounding his final book, The Sadness of Christ. More wrote and edited that book while imprisoned in the Tower of London awaiting execution. The book is a moving contemplation of Jesus' suffering at the end of his life and how that can be a model of Christian virtue for us. It's 500 years old, but thankfully it's still in print, and it offers valuable lessons and reflections for us today. But even then, at death's door, More was focused on prayer and exploring sacred scripture. And lastly, let me just touch upon another characteristic of St. Thomas More, his humor and happiness. One of his lesser-known qualities was his sense of humor. He was actually a renowned prankster, if you could believe it. He was known to pull pranks on everyone. Perhaps not the king, but his fellow jurists and lawyers. There's one story in which he's in court, and one of his fellow judges is hearing a case of a victim of a pickpocketing. Somebody had their purse stolen, And one of More's fellow judges criticizes the victim for not holding on to their purse tightly enough. And More took exception with this victim shaming, and after the proceedings were over that day, he visited the pickpocket in prison, and he hatched a plan with the pickpocket. And he said, I want you to pick the pocket of the judge who made the comments today. Tomorrow, I want you to do it tomorrow. So they hatched this little plan with this criminal. The next day, the pickpocketer is in court again, and More arranges this situation where the pickpocketer had to pass by the judge who had made the comments. He successfully picked the pocket of the judge and signaled More that he had done it. The pickpocket sits down, and then More contrives this excuse for the whole court to be suspended and for an act of contributions of charity to be given by everyone. So everyone pulls out their pocketbook and gives, they pass the cup around for the poor, and the judge realizes that his purse is gone. And More calls him out for it, and he has the pickpocket return the purse, and he kind of makes a model out of the judge. That's kind of the sort of prank he would pull. The one that was really extraordinary, I couldn't believe until I read it, is 2 days before he was killed, before he was executed, 2 days before his head is cut off, Thomas More is in the Tower of London, and he has friends and family coming one after another, begging him to relent and recognize the king. Come along with us, Thomas. Just do it for us, that sort of thing. But More wouldn't relent. But a friend was visiting, and Thomas More, to have some fun with him, said to his friend, I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind. And this friend was so ecstatic that he ran to see Henry VIII, the king, and told Henry VIII that More was going to relent. And Henry VIII was a lot of things. He was a lot of terrible things. He was completely immoral. He was a reprobate, but he wasn't stupid. And so he sent the messenger back to More to confirm that More was going to recognize him as the head of the church. And More said, no, when I said I was going to relent and change my mind, I've decided not to shave before my execution and keep my beard. He was messing with him. 2 days before his own execution, he's joking around with folks. Even at the end of his life, he kept his good humor. And it reminded me of something that Archbishop Fulton said during his lifetime in the last century, that, quote, in the history of the world there has never been a sad saint, because sanctity and sadness are opposites. And I think history finds no better example of Sheen's observation than the great Thomas More. And we know humor is so important in everyday life, especially in stressful situations like law school, so I think the message from St. Thomas More is smile, play a harmless joke on your friend, and blame the saints. So today, St. Thomas More, we are 450 years removed from him, a conscience-guided, devout Catholic who defied the world, who clung to his beliefs, and paid the ultimate price with a smile on his face. And we have much to learn from him. Now, I suspect none of us will be called upon to make the sort of momentous choice and sacrifice that Thomas More did. But in smaller ways, as professionals, especially as Catholic lawyers, we must navigate the cultural and political and professional challenges of the modern age. You don't have to open a newspaper far to see all the hot-button legal issues that are permeating culture, such as immigration, capital punishment, judicial independence. How do we as Catholic professionals, Catholic lawyers, navigate and approach these concepts? I think for you all, I think one of your next biggest choices may be, who do I accept an offer of employment from? And what sort of company and organization is that? Do they reflect my values? Will they allow me to live my values? I myself had to kind of confront that. RJ mentioned that after law school, I joined the law firm of Jones Day. It's a big international law firm. And at the time, in 2001, they were most prominently known for defending the tobacco industry. And I knew that I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to lend my license to defend the tobacco industry. And so I had a very candid conversation with them. And their message to me was, Jeff, it's a big firm. We've got a lot of clients, we handle a lot of matters, and there's thousands of lawyers. You're not going to agree with everything, but you can use and follow and guide your conscience in selecting which matters to work on. And I really appreciated that. And as a result, I joined the firm and I had a wonderful experience. These days, Jones Day is most closely associated with the Trump administration. I don't know if you follow the legal times as lawyers do, but I'm sure that's an impediment to some younger progressive lawyers signing on at the firm. And it was, I had those same reservations. But what's interesting is if you just look at a firm in one respect and not holistically, you'd miss the big picture. And, Jones Day, for all its associations with the president and his party, for the last 11 years has had what's called the Border Project, where they opened an office in El Paso, Texas. And this office overlooks the border, the physical border between Mexico and the United States. And from that office, they can see people coming into the United States, both adults and unaccompanied minors. And the firm has helped thousands of people find counsel and guidance who have come across the border. And you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you looked at the firm holistically, kind of as I finally did when I overcame my reservations. So as Catholics, we have a moral imperative to seek and secure justice, especially for those in the shadows and on the fringes of life. Injustice comes in many forms, and sometimes it's hard to identify. Obviously, we can identify the sorts of kangaroo courts that convicted Jesus Christ and convicted St. Thomas More, but then there are the harder, the different shades of injustice. I think, for example, back on the Civil Rights Movement, Catholic lawyers played a very prominent role in the 1950s and 60s, assisting in the liberation of many people to equality. And even my alma mater, Notre Dame, Father Ted Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame, was on the forefront of that civil rights movement. And so many of these questions are difficult, but thankfully for us, we do have models of fidelity and integrity and sacrifice to follow and emulate, first and foremost in our blessed Lord Jesus and following him in his saints. So I'll close with this. After St. Thomas More's execution, he was mourned across the whole of the Catholic world. The Holy Roman Emperor wouldn't believe that he had been executed until it was actually confirmed by the English ambassador. Lincoln's Inn, which is kind of the law school, one of the law schools of London, and the one to which Thomas More belonged, they were so distraught at the judicial murder of their colleague that they canceled Christmas that year in 1535. One of his dear friends, Erasmus, who himself was a great Enlightenment thinker, observed that Thomas More was, quote, a genius such as England never had before nor ever will again. And incredibly, there's not much dispute as to the validity of that statement 500 years on. And I think it would be fitting for my parting words to kind of invoke the last words of St. Thomas More just before his execution, when he was on that holy scaffold. He announced, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." And that, my friends, more than anything else, sums up the tension that you will all face at some point in your career, especially if you're an attorney in your practice, between fidelity to your client and fidelity to God. And for the sake of your soul, I hope you make the right choice.